Welcome back to lesson 6 of our study of how did we get our New Testament canon. In our last session, we looked at the books which made up group number 3, the Apocrypha books and the orthodox books, which were generally rejected by everyone as not being apostolic writings. In other words, not being written or approved by the Lord's apostles. And so tonight we want to start looking at group number 2. This is a very small group of books which at one time were heavily disputed, but eventually they were accepted by the majority as being apostolic, in other words, inspired writings. Now, here are the 7 books that we'll be talking about from this group. You got Hebrews, James, 2nd Peter, 2nd John, 3rd John, Jude, and Revelation. Notice First Peter and First John, they're not in this group, which I find interesting because they were never disputed. But there were a lot of Christians who started questioning the authenticity of these 7 specific books. This resulted in a lot of discussion and a lot of debate during the second and especially into the 3rd century. Should these books be included or not? That's the question and the dilemma that they were facing. In fact, there were many Christians who were insisting that these books should not be included at all. But somehow they came to the conclusion and eventually they recognized that, yeah, they indeed are, they do have apostolic authority. First being accepted by the majority of Christians and then eventually recognized by local councils. We know at least there are 2 councils that fall into that group at the end of the 4th century and in the beginning of the 5th century. That was down in Carthage, northern Africa. And so what this tells us is that it was at the end of the 4th century where, for the first time, our current version of the canon was finally recognized. However, it's important to note that this was not the first time when the full list of books appear, as together as a list in some way or another. The list of these 27 books actually first appeared in the middle of the 4th century. And that's important because this shows us that it wasn't a single individual or it wasn't a special select group or even an elite council who all of a sudden decided it for themselves and then forced this final list on everybody else. Well, to see how all of this played out, let's start with a fellow by the name of Athanasius, who was born around 298 AD, and therefore he lived most of his life during the 4th century. Now, Athanasius, or I have a hard time with that name. Sorry, Athanasius was a deacon at the church in Alexandria, and eventually he was appointed as a bishop in that church. Being one of the church leaders was not what made him so famous, though. He became famous as a defender of the deity of Christ. Now, Constantine, the emperor, most of us are familiar, most of you are familiar with the emperor of Rome at that time period. This was in the early of the 4th century, and in 313 AD, Constantine he issued the Edict of Milan. Now, this edict it changed everything for Christianity at that time. It went from being an illegal, and persecuted religion to not only being legal, but it became an officially favored religion of the Roman Empire. Again, we're talking about 313. Well, not about, we're talking at 313 AD. And then about a half a dozen years or so after that edict that was made by Constantine, a presbyter, in other words, an elder, whose responsibility, by the way, was to spiritually feed the flock, right? Well, this church leader's name was Arius of Alexandria. And Arius began to teach, according to John chapter 1, that, well, here's his quote: God begot him, and before he was begotten, he did not exist. He's referring to Jesus, who was the Word, and that Jesus was a created being. He was not God himself. And so you can see that this was a major issue and completely the opposite of what the Apostle John was saying and teaching in his gospel. And so this false teaching, it led to a major controversy, and you can understand why, between the two sets of bishops. One group of bishops, known as the Arians, held to what Arius was teaching, and that is that Jesus was a created being. And then the other group said, no, Jesus is the Son of God. He is God. And so the Emperor Constantine, who actually, he turned Christianity into a favored religion. He didn't like this bickering and fighting that was going on between church leaders at all. He wanted an end to it. And so he called for a meeting of everyone who's involved in this fighting. This meeting became known as the famous Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. Now, as it turns out, it was during this time that Athanasius, he became the leader of the opposition party against the Arians. And thanks to his efforts, the debate was somewhat settled. And thus the Nicene Creed was developed and was signed by those bishops attending that Council of Nicaea. Uh, this had nothing to do with the canon, by the way, or any documents making up the New Testament. It primarily dealt with the deity of Christ. But I said all of that just to give you some background as to what was going on at this particular time in the early part of the 4th century and where Athanasius fits in to all of this. And it's important to note that Athanasius, who you're now familiar with, he wrote a lot of documents, including letters which he produced on a yearly basis, sort of like a periodic newsletter. And because of his background in opposing the Arians, some of his writings were about the deity of Christ. And it was in one of his famous annual letters, now towards the middle of the 4th century, where he happens to mention, among other things, a number of recommended books for reading. Again, this is in the middle of the 4th century. His recommendation included the list of 27 books, which we have in our canon. This was the first time in history that we actually see the full set of books mentioned in a complete list. Now, that doesn't mean the canon was fixed or that you had an official Bible at that time, because even after his famous letter, there were still disputes going on about the list, especially with the book of Revelation, for example. Some still, they wanted to throw that book completely out of the list. However, the bottom line is this, as I mentioned, the canon was finally accepted by the majority of Christians as a complete set, not in the middle of the 4th century, but at the end of the 4th century. And ever since that time, the world has had a fixed canon of 27 books right up until this day. And so the question is, how did that list become recognized as a legitimate list? In other words, what was the criteria that was important to them to make sure which books they were to keep? Well, we already mentioned it briefly, so let me repeat it again. The criteria leading to the fixed canon was that they had to be sure that each book on this list was inspired. That's the bottom line. In fact, this is key. It was the Christians' desire to know which books were truly inspired and which ones were not. It's always been that way from the very beginning. They were very careful with which books they would read publicly as apostolic and which books would be read as something maybe useful but not actually inspired, the inspired word of God. I mean, that'd be similar to teachers or preachers today when they might quote yeah, commentary or make a comment themselves from a particular book written by another Christian. Someone who makes a valid point on some doctrine. But at the same time, when they did that, they always made it clear that they didn't consider that particular document as inspired. Even the influential Christians during those early times, like Ignatius and Clement of Rome, if you remember, when they wrote something, they would say something like, well, I'm not writing to you as an apostle. I'm writing to you as a condemned man, as Ignatius said. There was a clear distinction in their mind in the beginning of the 2nd century that not every writing is the same. You have apostolic writings, which were to be accepted, in other words, received, as a direct message from Jesus Christ himself, which you ought to obey and you ought to read publicly. And then there were the other non apostolic writings that were useful, they were helpful, and it's okay to read them, but the attitude was completely different. You respected them, but they didn't have the same weight. In other words, the same level of respect that the inspired writings had. Okay, so let's see what we have with this group of 7 disputed books, books that were actually rejected at one time. Now, what makes this book interesting is when we compare them to those orthodox books that were also rejected. You remember from category 3, I'm referring to the rejected orthodox writings such as First Clement. Um, those books, they had many subjective reasons that would make them appealing to Christians. In other words, they had personal reasons that would make them acceptable. And at the same time, there were as many, if not more subjective reasons to reject these 7 books. Wait a minute, does that make sense? Understand what I'm saying here. For example, there was nothing in First Clement that I know of that would sound suspicious or alarming, to a reader of the first century and even into the second century. There was nothing suspicious. But in the case of these 7 books, there were things that may have been alarming to a reader at that time. Why? What was alarming? In other words, what could have been the difficulties with these books? Well, basically, there were considerable and there were considerable and widespread doubts about their apostolic origin. Let me break it down this way. You remember how we saw the early Christians and what they wrote, that they would often read the letters from Paul and they would share them and they would use them and refer to them for doctrinal authority and reference. Well, there were almost no sure signs of usage of Second Peter or Second and Third John or Jude among the very earliest Christians. We cannot trace them back to the very beginning, to the beginning of the second century, or even to the middle of the second century for some of them. Plus the letter attributed to Jude, that's quotes from Jewish Apocrypha, which were known as not to be inspired. How could an inspired author quote an unacceptable, uninspired source? Some might say, well, didn't Paul do that himself? I mean, he quoted Greek poets. Well, yeah, but it's one thing when you quote a Greek poet rhetorically to confirm that what you say about a citizen of some country was already accepted by the people of that country. In Paul's example, the poet is a reliable source about his own country. I mean, who could know that better than a representative of that country? So if the author admits something that everybody recognizes as fact, you can use it as an argument. But it's another thing when you quote a passage or a piece of information as if it is reliable. But the source used is not reliable, such as a Jewish Apocrypha, which was quoted by Jude. And they really had major problems and doubts about the orthodoxy of the teaching in the book of Revelation. That's because it was heavily used by heretics and false teachers to promote their false doctrines and their theories. Orthodox Christians didn't know what to do with it. They didn't know what to do with this book and how to understand it. And so as a result, some would say, okay, this book is not orthodox. It can't be included in the list. And here's what I meant when I said it's interesting to compare this group of 7 rejected books with those 3 orthodox books, which were also rejected. The same majority who were determined to reject First Clement, a book that they liked it very much, eventually accepted these 7 books as scripture, books that they didn't like so much. This is a fact. And this fact that they somehow came to accept books they didn't like, this fact needs explanation. There has to be some logical reason for this. And the reason could only be one of three possibilities. The first possibility could be that they were subjective in their reasoning. Subjective. In other words, they had personal reasons or favoritism towards these books. Or the second possibility could be that, well, they were mistaken and they were careless in their thought process when bringing them back in. Or the third possibility could be that they were they were objective and they found sufficient evidence to come to a final conclusion. Now, before we continue, I want to make it clear once again that the Word of God always existed. His commandments and his instructions to his people, how to serve him, how to serve and love each other, how to become his child and live righteously. All of that always existed. I mean, even before any of the 27 books were ever written. All we're doing in this series is to discover how these 27 books got here. And this part of our study is really an eye opener because we will see the difficulty that it was for these seven books to be included back into the list. All right, so let's look at these three possibilities as to why, starting with the first one. The first possibility is to ask the question, was their reasoning subjective? I mean, if that's the case, then that implies that those Christians overlooked evidence or the lack of evidence for the sake of something else. For example, maybe they wanted to promote certain subjective doctrines, practices, and things like that. And as a result of their motives, these books then were good for doing that. They all decided, let's smuggle this into the list of inspired books. But if that's so, the subjective reason or personal motivation for each book had to be extraordinary because this option or reasoning didn't work with First Clement, shepherd of Hermas, or nor the epistle of Barnabas. They had subjective motivation to bring those three into the list because they liked them. And so either they were subjective with an extraordinary motivation or they thought they were being objective, but they were sincerely mistaken, which is the second possibility. In other words, the early Christians, they were sincere, but they made a mistake. And they based their decision not on sufficient evidences. If so, there still had to be some reason or very strong motives for them to be less careful with these particular books because they were very careful to trace the shepherd of Hermas, to trace First Clement and Barnabas, and in so doing, they were able to discard them as scripture. They had the same means to trace these seven books as well. Plus, these seven books were suspicious. So why would they not be careful? Good question, yeah? Well, there's no reasonable answer for that question. And so that leaves us with our third possibility. Their reasoning was objective and sufficient. That is, that these books were checked in the same way as the others. In other words, they were traced back to the time and the place of their origin and found to be supported by convincing evidences concerning their inspiration. In other words, about them being apostolic. Okay, so this is only a brief overview of these three possibilities as to how to explain why the early Christians eventually accepted these seven books. Subjective reasoning, they made a mistake, or objective and sufficient evidence. And so what we need to do is investigate each option a little deeper and see if we have enough evidences either to agree or disagree with these early Christians concerning these seven books. All right, so what more can be said about option one? Well, maybe they were subjective because there was something interesting, within the book or these books, or something that was appealing to them, something that was convenient, maybe or it was doctrinal, something doctrinal that they liked. And as a result, they accepted these letters in spite of evidences that were against them. However, doctrinal or other convenience factors did not help the other three more convenient books, as already mentioned. In fact, Revelation was doubted because of doctrinal issues. So this factor was a negative here. You cannot say that Revelation was accepted because it was very helpful teaching them doctrine. The reality was exactly the opposite. Orthodox Christians were very uncomfortable with this book. It was the heretics, the Gnostics, who liked this book, and they were comfortable with it. So by accepting this book back in, it didn't make their life easier for the Orthodox Christian, it made their lives more complicated. On the other hand, except for Revelation, the other six books, they were never used by anyone as a means to introduce any new doctrine. Again, if these books were slipped in against any evidence, there had to be a reason for them to do that. Therefore, that means these books had to be used in order to satisfy a subjective reason. But we find no traces of any attempt to build anything, to insist on anything, or to change any doctrine because of the content of these letters. So why would they include them subjectively if we find no evidence of them being used subjectively? Now, as far as Revelation, that was used by heretics and false teachers, to try and introduce new and strange doctrines. But it was never used by the Orthodox majority. There's no question why the heretics were interested in including it. It was easy to understand that they would be subjective to include it. But the very thing that made this book useful for the heretics shows that it was not useful, not comfortable for the Orthodox Christians. So the majority could not have accepted it back in just because they liked it. That's the point I'm trying to send home here. The reason why it was excluded and why it was the last book to be included has to do with those heretics, plus the fact that the Orthodox Christians didn't know what to do with this book. And so the heretics, they were quick to twist this book so they can suggest their false ideas as if they were being taught by the Apostle John. The false teachers of that day, they loved this book for subjective reasons, which why they fought hard to include it. And what's interesting is that those heretics didn't need to accept this book subjectively because there were objective evidences to keep it. And here's what's just as interesting. The Orthodox Christians rejected all seven books for subjective reasons. So there were no ordinary or extraordinary subjective motives for the masses to finally accept these books. That's just a fact. There's no evidence that would question this conclusion. So let's put that possibility aside and talk a little bit more about the second possibility, the possibility that they were sincerely mistaken. Well, when considering the book of Hebrews, they could hardly have been careless. Hebrews became an issue because they were careful. They were careful enough to notice internal difficulties. When studying the book, they recognized, hey, the stylistic differences, they're too big between this book, Hebrews, and the rest of the Pauline letters. Sometime in the 3rd century, when they noticed that there's this difference stylistically, that's when they discarded the book out of the list of Orthodox readings. And so this shows that they were very careful to exclude it, not careless. When the Bishop of Alexandria, he came to the conclusion that the author of Hebrews could not be Paul, he got rid of it without asking permission from anyone or from any council. And others were starting to make that same decision. And so with the book of Hebrews, we can know for sure that they were not careless or mistaken for eventually accepting it back in. The fact is that it was the opposite. In the end, it was included. Therefore, somehow they were mistaken for excluding it in the first place. As for James, Second Peter, Second and Third John, and Jude, they provided more than enough reasons for doubts as well and causing suspicion. I mean, look at James, for example. A very early book, could be as early as mid 40s, maybe late 50s. I mean, we're talking in the middle of the first century. And at that time, Christians primarily met in Jewish synagogues, not church buildings. And that letter, in its context, it's very Jewish, to say the least. It starts off with, to the 12 tribes of the dispersion. And so that didn't sit very comfortable for Gentile Christians of the second and especially into the third century. What do we need this book for? They're saying. And then turning to Second Peter, there were internal stylistic differences compared to First Peter, and the question became, why would Second Peter repeat or say the same thing as in the letter by Jude? Who's Jude? Why would Peter quote Jude? Why accept Jude, or why did Jude quote from Second Peter? Because Second Peter was not well known. And as for Second and Third John, who needs those letters anyway? I mean, they're so small, short little letters, and there's really not much information in them. What we're doing is we're looking at some of the objections they had. And so everything that we know about the early Christians is that they were careful about their writings. And everything we know about James, Second Peter, Second and Third John, and Jude is that these letters have nothing in them that would force or cause those Christians to be less careful about researching them. So in the face of all this, we can't find any evidence of them accepting these books by mistake. And so what this is telling us is that prior to the fourth century, there appears to be no urgency to know the whole list of the New Testament. In other words, no urgency to know for sure all about books like James, Second Peter, Second and Third John, and Jude. I mean, they were satisfied with not including them as apostolic, which means there was not much of a reason to investigate these books, even by those who had doubts. Well, leads us to something which plays a major part in the story. In the early fourth century, it became a matter of life and death to know the exact list of inspired writings. The believers needed to know which books they could reject and which books they cannot reject. I mean, we're talking about to the point of death. So if the majority would be willing, excuse me, to die for any disputed books, it means that they could not be accused of accepting them because of personal subjectivity or for carelessness. On the other hand, as I just stated, prior to the fourth century, the Christians were not concerned about a full, exact list of inspired writings. Origen, for example, if you remember, he was able to make a personal judgment that First Clement may be inspired. Remember when he said, I think it is inspired. Well, let me emphasize this point. There was not a specific need, and the key word is need, for Christians to check every book. They were only checking books that presented some kind of a need to check. Only books that would cause controversies or suspicions. Not something that threatened their lives, though. But in the beginning of the fourth century, that all changed. You needed to know which book was authentic because your life was depending upon it. This changed the dynamics and it created a specific need. Which book can you give up? Because you know it's not inspired. And by doing so, you'd spare your life. And so the point is this. There is no evidence that the early Christians could be reckless in examining and accepting these books. And what we learned from the previous lessons about early Christianity is that they had all the means, they had mechanisms that were available exclusively to them at that time to verify the books. And the fact of the matter is that they eventually accepted these 7 books in spite of any of the difficulties they faced. And so that leaves us with the third possibility. they were objective. It was something outside of themselves, which was sufficient for them to accept these books. These books were checked in the same way as every other book. They were traced back to the time and place of their origin and found to be supported by convincing evidence concerning their inspiration. Now, it's easy to imagine that all the doubts, all the suspicions, all the disputes were resolved by going back to the source and establishing the origin of the book and finding that it originates with an apostle or was authorized by an apostle. Given the available information that they had about these 7 books, well, it was enough to show that there were no strong reasons to continually reject them. So let us then be just as noble, just as diligent to look closer at these 7 books ourselves so we can better understand how they came to their conclusions. And so what we're going to do in the next few sessions is to look deeper into the details of the what, how, and the why they did what they did. And we'll look at very interesting historical evidence about Hebrews. I'm talking about physical evidence from around the turn of the 3rd century. Now, I didn't go into the specifics about what was that life and death situation, in the 4th century, which changed everything. Well, we're going to cover all of that next week. And so I want to thank you again for sticking with me through a lot of historical and technical details. And I look forward to our next session together. Have a good evening.